Welcome back to the 13th part in this Python series on the Django REST framework. In this one we're going to carry on building the backend API part of this application, and we're actually going to talk about put requests. Or in other words, how are we going to save the data from our to-do list application front end to our database essentially, and store that data that the user has been able to create. Now, we're not going to be hooking up to the to-do list in this video, but we are going to simulate a request that a front end might make and be able to save that data to our database. So to get started, I'm going to go back to my views in the to-do list application, and at the moment we have a GET request. So we can go over to the API, we've got to do /API, and if I refresh this, you can see we've got the GET data, or in other words, the data for the object currently stored in the to-do model in the database. Now, what we can't at the moment do is add data to this unless we sort of just do it manually, maybe through the Django admin shell, for example, or by some other means, but we can't actually make a request through the API to be able to do that. So let's go and define that. First, I want to define a new method, and in the REST framework for this subclass of API view, what I want to call the method is actually going to be the request type. So it could be, for example, post, or in this case, put, and I'm going to say self and request, because they always get request. And what I want to do is essentially just have reference to the serializer again. So we've already got the serializer defined, and this is actually enough information to be able to support a put request without us sort of needing to modify the actual serializer itself. So if we go back to our view, I simply want to use it again, so I'm going to say serializer is equal to to-do serializer. Because remember, we're serializing data that we want to go to the same model, so the serializer can sort of dictate all of that for us. And now for the attribute, I want to say data, because we're taking data in rather than sort of spitting data out like you would with a GET request. So we don't have any data that we know of from the database to want to sort of pass in. Instead, I want to almost pull in the data from the request made by the user. So that's going to be data is equal to request.data. And then what I want to do, just to check that it's working straight away, I'm just going to try and return serializer, so response serializer.data, and that should actually be enough for us to try and make a put request. So I guess the next problem I have is, how would I test this? Because we haven't hooked up our front end to be able to make a put request to our sort of database to be able to save data to it. And really, normally that'd be quite difficult, because you might want to come up with some sort of generic application that has a form on it which allows you to submit data, have that data validated, and then save to the database if it is valid. But the Django REST framework actually helps us do a lot of that for us. So if I actually go over to the API interface that the Django REST framework gives us, what I can do is refresh. And now, simply because we've defined that we want put support for our API here, it's not only given us the updated list of the supported request types, HTTP request types that's supported by this API endpoint, which now includes put, which it didn't before, but it also gives us this really nice form for us to be able to sort of test whether our API is working as we expect it to, and we can sort of modify the request data in quite a raw format here, which is quite nice for sort of testing purposes and seeing what data you actually need your front end to be passing in, rather than just having sort of another layer of abstraction which might complicate things. So to test this, I suppose, let's go ahead and send some data. Now, I guess first, the next question is, what data would you send? So if I said something like hello world, is it going to work? It's probably not, because we haven't really specified a format, but let's try it. So, it complains because I've got a typo here somewhere. Request. So let's try that again. I'll just refresh. So let's just type in some text here and see if that makes put request. Now, if your request isn't valid, this is probably what you're going to get an error that looks like, or something similar. So it says it wasn't able to pass the JSON that you gave it. Now this text box down here expects a JSON format, and our text was just sort of generic plain text, which clearly wasn't in a JSON format. So we do need to provide our request in a JSON format, which makes sense because it's a JSON API, and then it also gives you some info about where that error occurred, and of course it was the first character because it didn't start with the open curly bracket. So now that we know it's in JSON format, I'm going to create a dictionary which is going to match the sort of API format. So in other words, if you're not too sure, you can always look at the serializer, and in this case, well, Django gives us the ID, but we need to specify text and done. So that's what I'm doing now. So I've got done equals false. It doesn't matter which order, of course, because a dictionary can be unordered, but I'm also going to specify text, so that's the other one, and I'm going to say this is a test, and we'll see if that works. So we can put that, but now we get another error. So in this case it's because, as I was saying before, the REST framework does do a lot of work for you, but it still sort of needs you to invoke a few methods when it comes to validating and sort of, do you actually really want to return this data? Shouldn't you really make sure it's valid first? So that's what it's sort of prompting us to do here. And it says, it's quite helpful in this case actually, it says you should either call isValid, which is what we're going to do, or access initial data instead. So isValid is probably what we're going to do now. So I'm going to go back to the view, and instead of returning straight away, I'm going to say, I'm going to indent that return statement and say if serializer dot is valid, then that's going to be our check to say, okay, so this data was correct, the request sort of worked, and I want to save that to the database. So I'm going to do serializer dot save, and that's going to save the data to the database itself. And then I'm just going to return that particular object which was requested. Now it really doesn't matter, you can put anything here, that's not particularly important. You might just want to return a status, for example. In fact, we could do that. Yeah, we'll do that afterwards, in fact. But then what I like to do also is, if the request didn't work, I like to say sort of return another response here, but it's going to be called well, it's going to return itself serializer.errors. So if there are errors in the request that you made, it's going to show them in the response, and also it's going to have a status. So all HTTP requests have a status. If it's a bad request, for example, it's going to be a 400. So I need to use status, and we haven't imported this yet, but status it's going to be HTTP 400 bad request. And if you're curious as to where you sort of get these definitions from, they are actually on the documentation for the Django REST framework, just in case you can't remember them. But as I said, I need to import status, so I'm going to do that. I'll just do that right at the top. From Django REST framework, similar to the other imports, and then I'm going to do import status. So that should give us access to all those statuses that we have. And if there are any errors in processing that request, then it's going to return it. Basically, if the request wasn't valid, then it's going to present those errors. And I think that should be it. So we've got the object saved in the database if it's valid, and then we're going to return data. So let's go ahead and try that. Now you can still see the form, which means we're still in a working state. But now I want to go ahead and make another request, so I'm going to enter some more test data, and I'm going to say put. And now you can see it's actually given us the object itself with an ID, which was decided by our sort of Django backend, and it's also got the text that I specified, as well as the status of the done attribute. So that means that we've successfully made a put request, saved that data to our database, and serialized it in the response. In the next one then, we're going to carry on with the front end and making the actual put request to be able to call our API endpoint.